Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States, now in its 41st printing. I am using, for reading purposes, the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an older edition, the headers will line up, but probably the pages will not. You'll have to dig around to figure out where I am if you have an older edition. Remember, there is still a newer edition available and free on our website, the 20th anniversary edition. And to get it, all you have to do is send us your email, scroll down on the page at wildworldofhistory.com, scroll down to where it says get our newsletter, send us your email, and you will get the 20th anniversary edition free. This consists of a PDF of the years 2018 to 2023, so the last 5 years, and about 20 pages of new material that I've added over the last 5 years in the way of insert. So I will say on page 176, after the third paragraph, insert these paragraphs. That's why it really helps. You really must start with the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an older edition anyway, you're out of date. So get the 15th anniversary edition and get the free update, making it the 20th anniversary edition. Again, if you're not familiar with Wild World of History, I have full curricula in U.S. and world history that include teacher's guides, student guides, tests, answer keys, and me teaching every chapter in high production video with all sorts of maps, charts, images on my shoulder behind me. It's really good stuff, and the price is going to go up here very soon. We haven't really raised prices in the last 6 years. I think we did one small price hike. But Bidenomics, okay, this is the Biden special at 20%, right? So if you want to get the course, you should do it before June 1st when our prices go up $20. But then after July 15th, the convention specials are over and they double. So you have a chance to get it half price with an additional $20 off if you act now. And best part about it, it's all yours. It's all digital, downloadable. You print it as your student uses it, and there's no license to expire. It's yours as long as you need it, with as many kids as you need it. Now, I have a number of co-op and small group education kinds of arrangements going on. I ask if you've got more than 5 kids using it, you buy a second copy. I can't police that, but I ask if you're doing a co-op with, say, 15 kids, you buy 3 copies, one for every 5 kids. And it helps them too, because you might be able to space out the videos, because the video is going to go to whoever bought it on their email. So you might be able to add different emails in there. All right. Enough of that. Let's get started. We are in the Civil War. We are in Chapter 9. We are in Crisis of the Union. We started last time under the header Bull Run. I'm almost done with that, and then we'll get a little bit into the header Water War. So I'm on page 332 of the 15th anniversary edition. Paragraph 2. Actually, it's the first full paragraph. McClellan did have 3 traits that made him too popular to replace easily. First, he fed his army well and displayed it on parade whenever possible. He was viewed as cautious with the lives of his soldiers, and he displayed great energy and confidence by dashing around on his horse in view of troops. McClellan obtained good rations and established new examination boards that produced better quality officers, raising his reputation among line soldiers. Second, he paid the army regularly. And lastly, through his reluctance to engage the enemy, the army suffered few casualties. These traits earned him the admiration of his soldiers and the affection of the public that would only dissipate after his first major loss at Antietam, when he failed to roll up Lee's army. But they also evoked unceasing frustration for the president. Lincoln bore a considerable degree of responsibility, however, for making McClellan into a monster. The president's unaffected manner of speaking, his penchant for storytelling to make a point, and above all, his lack of social refinement led McClellan to misjudge him. The general wrote that Lincoln was, quote, not a man of strong character, certainly in no sense a gentleman. Lincoln's deference finally reached its end. Unhappy with McClellan's dithering, in January 1862, Lincoln issued the President's General War Order No. 1, instructing McClellan to move forward by February. As he had throughout most of the previous few months, McClellan outnumbered his rebel opponents by 3-1, yet he still advanced cautiously in what has been labeled the Virginia Peninsula Campaign of 1862. Rather than approach Richmond directly, McClellan advanced obliquely with an army of 112,000 men along the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, where the Union Navy could provide cover. As McClellan reached near Richmond, things fell apart. First, Lincoln unwisely reduced McClellan's command by withholding Irwin McDowell's entire corps in a reorganizing of the army, placing McDowell south of Washington to protect the capital. Second, McClellan wasted valuable time, a month, capturing Yorktown, begging Lincoln for McDowell's men, who finally headed south toward Fredericksburg. McClellan reluctantly moved on Richmond. By that time, Lee had become the commander of the Army of the Northern Virginia, as it was then called, and McClellan's main foe. Lee's second-in-command, Stonewall Jackson, set the table for Union failure through a series of bold raids on Yankee positions all over the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson's high theater struck terror in the hearts of Washingtonians who were convinced he was going to invade at any moment. See what I mean about constantly being aggressive? Despite the fact that Jackson only had 16,000 men facing more than 45,000 Union troops. He succeeded in distracting McClellan long enough that the opportunity to drive into Richmond vanished. Instead, the Union Confederate armies fought a series of moving battles throughout June and July of 1862, including the battles of Seven Pines, Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Frazier's Farm, and others. At Malvern Hill, McClellan finally emerged with a victory, though he had not taken Richmond. The battle could have served as a profound lesson for both Lee at Gettysburg and Grant at Cold Harbor when it came to hurling troops across open ground against artillery, and indeed was the only battle of the war on the Confederate side where more casualties were caused by cannon fire than musket fire. With a touch of painful irony, Confederate casualties at Malvern Hill numbered 5,600, strikingly similar to the losses in Pickett's charge. Murmurings in Washington had it that he could have walked into the Confederate capital, meaning McClellan, but the last straw, for now at least, for Lincoln came with a letter McClellan wrote on July 7th, in which the general stayed far from military issues and dispensed political advice well above his pay grade. Let me mention something there. The casualties at the entire Gettysburg 3-day battle were 30,000 for the Confederates. That's all casualties. That's killed, wounded, captured. So that's not 30,000 killed. Obviously, that number is about 1/3 that. I think the number killed at Gettysburg were around 10 or 11,000 on the Confederate side, but about half of those came on the third day when Pickett staged his charge. And remember, if 5,000 were killed, you're going to have about 15,000 wounded. And most of Pickett's entire corps was wiped out in that charge. At that point, a rising group of Republicans known as the Radicals emerged. Some of the Radicals had been abolitionists before the war, and they tended to view the conflict not only about emancipation, but also about cleansing from the body politic the disloyal and treasonous plantation elites of the Democratic Party they saw as having brought on the war. Among the most prominent radicals were Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, Joshua Giddings of Ohio, and Union General Carl Schurz, all of whom wanted to severely punish the South as a region and the Democratic Party for bringing on the war. When the radicals heard of McClellan's insubordination, not to mention in their eyes incompetence, they pressured Lincoln to remove him, and he acceded to their demands, replacing America's Bonaparte with General John Pope. Demoted as Supreme Commander, McClellan remained in charge of the Army of the Potomac. John Pope was a braggart who told Congress that if he'd been in charge from the beginning, his forces would already be marching through New Orleans. Pope was soon humiliated more than McClellan. Despite victories over Pope, Lee lost proportionally more staggering numbers of men. At the 7 days battles, Mechanicsville, Malvern Hill, for example, the South lost 5,700 men, 13% of the force committed. And at Second Manassas, it lost more than 9,000 men, more than 18% of the troops engaged. For the time being, however, Union congressmen's anger at the outcome concealed from them the new raw arithmetic of combat. In other words, you're losing 20% of your men, dude. You got 4 more battles and you got no more men. Even if you win the battles, if that's how much you're losing, see? And that's what Ulysses Grant ultimately understood that McClellan did not, was that the war would be over sooner, even if you had slightly higher total losses, because you were inflicting a higher percentage of losses on your enemy. Let's continue here with Water War on page 333. Oh, let me check something. I almost forgot. Let me check the 20th anniversary edition. Okay, I'm glad we did that because I missed this, although it's not going to shake up our narrative too much. So on page 331, after the first full paragraph saying the Confederate Army or who worked directly for it, referring to the use of slaves to work for the Confederate Army, we're going to insert a new paragraph, and it says, Union occupation of rebel territory answered the question about the object of the war. Increasingly, the stated objective, the restoration of the Union, demanded that the cause of war, slavery, be extinguished. And the first Confiscation Act raised the issue of the status of slavery in the border states. No action was planned there, but the directions of federal policy was obvious: emancipation. Congress, having already abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. in April 1862, then passed the Second Emancipation Act in July that suppressed, quote, insurrection to punish treason and rebellion and to seize and confiscate the property of rebels. This is from James Oakes's book, Freedom National, that I'll talk about in a moment. By using the term property of states still in rebellion, the Union used the South's own language against it. Ultimately, however, the Emancipation Proclamation lit the fuse, creating the political will and momentum that then required Republicans to enact actual laws to secure eventually the 13th Amendment. Now, here's the deal, and I laid this groundwork back maybe 10 or 12 lessons ago when we were discussing the rise of the Republican Party and slavery. And it is this: both the abolitionists and the diehard Southerners recognized that eventually the country had to become either all free or all slave. The abolitionist Northerners wanted to do it through a sort of suffocation of slavery by cutting it off from all the territories and begin chipping away at slavery every time they could, whether it was through an election where you'd have Republican postmasters or marshals or judges or whatever that would no longer support slavery. The South understood this too, and as I mentioned ad nauseum, this is why they fought so hard for slavery in the territories, because it wasn't going to just stay in the territories, it was going to eventually come back into the free states. So the second part of that, on both the perspective of the abolitionists and the Southerners, was if war came, eventually a victorious Union would impose emancipation on the Southern states. And that's what many Southerners who warned against the war saw, was that this is a question of, are you going to die quick or die slowly? You can stretch it out by moving into the territories and die slowly, or you can fight a war and die quickly. But slavery had no future, because if the Union won, they would extinguish slavery. And that's exactly what's starting to happen here as we see the Union making preparations for emancipation. All right, let's pick up here with water war on page 333. While conflict on land raged in the East, good news for the Union came from the war at sea. In September 1861, Navy flotillas had captured the forts at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, establishing a tiny beachhead in the south. 2 months later, the U.S. Navy seized South Carolina Sea Islands and Port Royal. The relatively easy conquest reflected both the North's superiority at sea and at the same time, the magnitude of the tasks that still remained. Jefferson Davis admitted as much, quote, at the inception of hostilities, he pointed out, we had no commercial marine, while their merchant vessels covered the ocean. We were without a navy while they had powerful fleets. Nevertheless, the Union had to cover more than 3,000 miles if one measured in a straight line rather than calculated the space of every inlet and bay. Policing the entire coastline was impossible, but grabbing key ports and invading from there was not. The blockade also posed the danger that an aggressive Union captain would fire on a foreign ship or board a neutral vessel. At all costs, Lincoln needed to keep Britain and France out of the conflict. In May, Britain announced strict neutrality, allowing for the Confederates to fight for their independence, but also acknowledging the legality of the Union blockade. The British could simultaneously recognize the Confederate and Union war aims as legitimate. Reality dictated that John Bull might, therefore, fall on the Union side since British ships could not cross the blockade line. In November 1861, however, when Jefferson Davis dispatched John Slidell and James Mason, not the actor, James Mason as permanent envoys to Britain and France aboard a British ship, the Trent, U.S. Navy Captain Charles Wilkes aboard the USS San Jacinto stopped the Trent by firing shots across her bow. Boarding the vessel, Union sailors removed Mason and Slidell and transported them to New York City, from where they were declared prisoners of war and remanded to Fort Warren in Boston. British outrage not only produced a stern letter from the foreign minister, but also was followed by a deployment of 11,000 redcoats to Canada and vessels to the Western Atlantic. Wilkes's unauthorized and unwise act threatened to do what the rebels themselves had been unable to accomplish, namely bring in Britain as a Confederate ally. Seward perhaps relished the developments, having failed to provide his multinational war of unification, but Lincoln was not amused. Scarcely a month after they were abducted, the two diplomats were released on Christmas Day, 1861. Britain considered this an acceptable apology, and the matter ended. All that remained of the naval war was the last gasp Confederate attempt to leapfrog the North with technology. Had the roles been reversed, the North, with its industrial and technical superiority, under pressure, might have successfully found a solution to a blockade. But for the already deficient Confederacy, despite its superlative Naval Secretary Stephen B. Mallory, the gap between the two combatants became obvious when the rebels launched their, quote, blockade breaker, the CSS Virginia. Better known as the Merrimac, the vessel was a Union steam frigate the Confederacy had confiscated when it took the Norfolk Navy Yard. Outfitted with 4 inches of iron siding, the ship was impressive compared to wooden vessels, yet hardly a technological marvel. Britain had launched an ironclad, the Warrior, in 1859, and I should add, had used ironclad but non-steam powered rafts with howitzers on them in the Crimean War. The Virginia's 10 guns fired from holes cut in the iron siding, which could be closed off by hand. A single gun covered the bow and stern. Most of the superstructure was above water, including the smokestack, lifeboat, and the entire gun deck. In March 1862, the Virginia sortied out under the command of Captain Franklin Buchanan to engage the Union blockading vessels at Hampton Roads. The astonished Yankee sailors watched their cannonballs bounce harmlessly off the sides of the monster, which quickly sank the Cumberland and then the Congress, 2 of the Navy's best frigates. The Union itself had already contracts for several variants of its own ironclads, known by the name of the lead vessel, the Monitor, under whose design was the brainchild of a brilliant Swedish designer, John Ericsson. It surpassed the Virginia in almost every category. At 172 feet long, its hull barely sat above the water line, leading to its description as, quote, a cracker box on a raft. It boasted a revolving turret with only 2 guns, capable of withstanding 10-inch shot at close range, and brandished its own 2 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore cannons. It also had some 50 of Ericsson's inventions aboard, including the first flushing toilets on a naval vessel. Upon the Monitor's arrival at Hampton Roads, it was charged with protecting the larger Minnesota. On March 9, 1862, the Virginia sallied forth, and Ericsson's Pygmy engaged it. Blasting away at each other for hours, neither could gain an advantage, but the Monitor could position herself where the Virginia could not bring a single gun to bear. Neither could seriously damage the other, and the 2 ships withdrew, each for different reason. The Monitor's captain had been blinded by a shell, and the Virginia's second in command, having replaced the wounded Buchanan, realized he could not outmaneuver or outshoot the Monitor with his current vessel. The Virginia's draft was so deep that it continually ran aground. Efforts to lighten the ship so that it could better maneuver only exposed its hull. Subsequently, the Virginia was run ashore and it burned when its commander feared that other ships like the Monitor were about to capture her. Later in December 1862, the Monitor sank in a gale off Cape Hatteras, but many of her sisters joined the Federal Navy in inland waterways and along the coast. Confederate Navy Secretary Mallory, meanwhile, had funded other ironclads. 37 had been completed or were under construction by the war's end. He also approved an experiment using a mine ram in an underwater vessel called the CSS Hunley, an unfortunate vessel that suffered several fatalities during its sea trials. It tended to sink a lot. Although not the world's first submarine, the hand-crank boat was the first to actually sink an enemy ship, the Housatonic, and itself. It would sail up and jam on a ram that had an explosive device in it, and the idea was it was going to back out. Well, they jammed the ram, but they couldn't back out. And it sank in February 1864. These efforts smacked of desperation. The Confederacy had neither the resources nor a sufficient critical mass of scientific and technical brain power or institutions to attempt to leapfrog the North in technology. I'm going to make a point, and I am not, read my lips, I am not calling the Confederates Nazis. I'm not making any such assertion. What I am saying is that their attempt to use technology to leapfrog a more numerous and well-supplied enemy, such as the Nazis did in World War II, where they were trying to get advanced Tiger II tanks and jet airplanes and rockets and all sorts of tricksy little hobbit things, where they were trying to get technology that could leapfrog the Allies. And of course, ultimately, they would hope to get the atomic bomb. This was preceded by the Confederates doing the same thing, trying to use these technological quick fixes to beat a more numerous and better supplied army. And they don't work, because for you to use a more high-tech weapon, you have to have a high-tech industrial complex behind it so that when it breaks down, you can fix it. This is what the Germans found on the battlefield with their high-tech Panther tanks, which were very, very good tanks, but they were like a modern-day BMW or Mercedes that needed constant attention, and in contrast to the U.S. Shermans, it could be fixed right on the battlefield. So this was a bad choice of resources by the Confederates. Okay, next time we'll pick up with the war in the West, and I will see you. I'm going to take off for a convention here, so we won't have a meeting on Friday, but I'll be back next Monday, and I'll see you then.